World War One, Part 8. I'm doing a whole bunch of videos together, and then I'll go back and edit them later, and it's going to take me a while. Try to get them up tonight. Okay. Um, Financing the war. Wars cost oceans of money, and this one did too. It was estimated after the war, and these are in the dollars of 100 years ago, far more purchasing power than now. The U.S. government spent between 33 and 34 billion dollars on World War One. Where does the money come from? Okay, governments have two ways of acquiring money, other than just making it up out of nothing, which is kind of what they do now. Now, those would be taxation and borrowing. We're going to have to do both. Both taxes are going to have to go up. We're going to have to increase the national debt by borrowing. Which one will we rely on the most? When we first entered the war, there was a probably fairly brief controversy over which one to rely on more. Some people wanted to keep the national debt in check by raising taxes. Others wanted to keep taxes from going up all that much and rely on borrowing. We relied on borrowing. Now, sometimes in class, I will ask the students to pretend that they are middle class people or maybe wealthy people during World War One. Which would you rather see? Would you rather see taxes go up or the national debt go up? And if you're clever and quick, you say the national debt. Because taxation, when the government takes your money through taxation, it is gone. You're not getting it back. But borrowing, who are they going to borrow it from? They're going to borrow it from you, and they're going to pay it back with interest. That's an easy one. So the United States government relied on borrowing for about 2/3 of how they financed the war, and taxes were raised to cover the rest. I'll deal with both quickly. Um, the U.S. government, and they did this 5 times, they would issue savings bonds. They used to advertise those on TV, and they're still around, but the interest rate is microscopic anymore. They called them Liberty bonds. There would be a special issue of bonds when a government or a business sells bonds. It is borrowing money from whoever buys the bond. Time was you could buy a $50 U.S. savings bond for $37.50, and after a number of years you could cash it in for $50. The difference would be the interest that you earned over that length of time. Shouldn't be too hard. And there'd be a great deal of a hype and build up on this, a lot of advertising and all of that. And when the great day came, when the bonds would be on sale, schools would close, businesses would close, everybody's gathered around the courthouse, and the 3-minute men, these would be people who were men and women both, who had generated for themselves their own little patriotic speeches. They'd deliver those. The band would play patriotic speeches, all that kind of thing, and the bonds would go on sale. They did this 5 times, 5 different Liberty bond drives. When they ran through the money from the first one, they went on to the second and the third and the fourth. Every single time the bond issue sold out on the day of issue. There were never any left over after the day. These were good investments, and they did pay off. Um, some genius that realized if you bought bonds here, you have invested in the war. Psychologically, it's not just the money, it's support for the war, because you have invested in it. You have a sense of ownership in the war effort. You feel like you're doing something. They would sell bonds in denominations, that's how much the bond would be worth at maturity, so low that it was only a mild overstatement to say school children could buy them with their lunch money. And again, it's not about the money, it's about giving people a sense of participation and ownership in the war. Okay, so that worked, and the bonds were repaid on time. Okay, borrowing, we had a brand new tax that they leaned on, only constitutionalized by the 16th Amendment, I believe, in 1913, and that would be the income tax, the tax on federal incomes, which was originally put forward on the promise that only the very wealthiest people would have to pay it, and the rates would never exceed 2%. Remember that next time somebody tries to peddle a, a constitutional amendment. Oh, it'll just be this. No, it won't. It's like the plant in the little shop of horrors. It's going to grow. So tax rates became much more progressive than in the past. If you don't know what that means, a progressive tax is one where you have different levels of taxation for different income levels. And the higher your income, the greater a percentage of the income you're going to pay. No one has yet shown me how that squares with equal protection of the laws. But the rates skyrocketed to around 6%. Nobody today is going to be impressed by that. That's how we financed the war. Then there's the matter of lining up public opinion in support of the war. And remember, we're divided on this. 50 House members voted against it. And by the way, the first woman was Jeanette Rankin of Montana. Voted against World War I, voted against declaring war on Japan the day after Pearl Harbor, lived long enough to participate in anti-Vietnam War rallies. Okay, she's a free American. She gets to do that. But Congress set up the Committee on Public Information. Its purpose was propaganda. Propaganda is efforts by government to influence public opinion. In a sense, advertising is propaganda. So how do we do this? How do we sell the war to the American public? To head this up, they tabbed a progressive journalist with impeccable credentials as a journalist. His name was Joseph Creel. Joseph Creel. Creel hesitated, but he took the job, and that influenced progressives. Progressives as a group overcame their pacifist skepticism and supported the war on a profound level. And some of them, if Joseph Creel's for it, how can I hold back? So what did they do? One thing, and I thought I'm leaving something out back earlier a couple of parts ago, and I was talking about factors that influenced us to go one way rather than the other. Go back and add this, but it fits here too. All the war news we got came from the Allied perspective. Like I said, Germany only had one transatlantic cable, and the British Navy cut that as soon as the war started. So the only news we get is from the Allied perspective. So both the Allied governments and the German government are trying to influence us. And what the British did, the British understood us better. The same language, all that. They knew where our hot buttons were. And so they know what makes us tick. So they present the war as this titanic apocalyptic struggle between good and evil, between democratic republics on one side, that's the Allies, and absolute militarist despotism on the other. And they just a dose at a time, a little at a time. By the time it's over, people have this mental image of Germans as being merciless barbarians, brutal people that gang rapes, bayoneting little babies or smashing their brains out against trees, stuff like that, mass murder. They're representing them as these hunchbacked, ape-like creatures, subhuman creatures with fangs. Those are the Germans, and they called them Huns, after barbarians who had invaded the Roman Empire in the mid-5th century and sacked Rome. I've come to think, if you know anything about Rome in the 5th century, Huns probably came in and took one look and said, we got to clean this place up. But there you go, they're barbarians. Whenever you really have to do something to somebody, it's human psychology, you begin by demonizing them, and that's what we did. So, and that's the way the Committee on Public Information did it. They recruited the voluntary cooperation of several 100,000, maybe at 150,000. It was way in the six figures of Americans who were in position to influence public opinion. Journalists especially, Hollywood, the movie industry is already going strong, teachers, ministers, they're the ones who encouraged people to generate a short speech you could give at a moment's notice. But in terms of journalism, nothing bad would ever be reported about the Allies or their troops. Nothing good or redeeming would ever be reported about the Central Powers. That should sound familiar. Think about how certain elements of the so-called news media today, how they treat the president. If they got 100 stories about our president, all 100 of them will be negative. There's nothing he can do that they would approve of except he die or resign. That, to me, drains them of credibility. It just, that can't be real. But don't get me started. Well, so the Committee on Public Information, and that caught fire and got out of hand. So you start to see vigilantism. It's where people kind of take the law into their own hands and sort of enforcing things against their neighbors. If you happen to have a German sounding name, you are suspect. So a lot of Americans whose ancestors had come from Germany would anglicize their names to make them sound less German. It wasn't just the U.S. Would you believe the British royal family did that? Okay, Queen Victoria's husband had been a German, Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. That doesn't sound British, so they changed it to Windsor. That's what it will always be. Okay, and schools and colleges stopped teaching courses in the German language. Symphony orchestras stopped producing symphonies written by German composers. Sauerkraut, that's a German word. Sauerkraut was renamed Victory Cabbage. And Dachshunds, little sausage dogs, some people call them, Dachshund, that's a German word. They became Liberty Pups. So this is out of hand. Now, once the war started, and the war ended abruptly, as we'll see, to roll off the table, all that angst is still out there, and it's mingling in with the general jitteriness about the accelerating pace of social change, cultural change, values change, and we're looking for scapegoats. And the Germans were the scapegoats as long as the war's going on, but once the war's over, we just start looking for other scapegoats, as we shall see. So we oversold the war to the American public. Hollywood, the movies they made had to support the war effort, and the federal government passed a law. I forget what the name of it was, but it made it a federal crime to criticize federal officials or bring them into ridicule. A Hollywood producer was prosecuted for daring to make a movie about the Revolutionary War showing the British as the enemy. Well, I think the deal was it's just not the time to bring that old stuff up. So that's how the economy was mobilized and public opinion was unified. Okay, social and economic changes. Just a couple of things. It's way wider than that. For one thing, less in this war than in the next, people moving around the country, and that weakens regional identities and so forth. We have women and minorities moving into the workforce, and although most of them lost their jobs after the war is over, last hired, first fired, still the change would be they would leave a permanent imprint. African Americans began abandoning the Deep South and moving north in about 1916. There have been two events in American history called the Great Migration. The first one was Puritans in the 1630s leaving England. This is the other. Large numbers of African Americans abandoning the Old South moved to the northern cities, New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, any northern city. They found that Northerners were scarcely less racist than the Southerners were, but in a big city, you have more freedom, and you have way more economic opportunity. So that happened, and it continued on unabated for at least 50 years. Okay, so those are the changes, and let me check the clock, and I'm going to come back in part, what's it going to be? Whatever the next one is. If this one's 8, that'll be 9. And we'll see how the war was fought and how we did that. But what did we do in the war?